They canceled her insurance policy the week after the funeral. Not a mistake, not an oversight, a decision. Someone in that family had gotten hold of the paperwork, called the carrier, and filed a change of beneficiary that had somehow been backdated to a Tuesday in March, when my wife could no longer hold a pen steady enough to sign her own name. I found out on a Thursday, sitting in a claims office in Scottsdale, listening to a representative tell me that Diane's death benefit had already been processed and paid out 3 weeks earlier to a beneficiary listed as Patricia Voss, her sister. I want you to sit with that number for a second, friend, because I sat with it a lot longer than a second. 3 weeks. Diane had been gone 5 weeks. They had moved on the policy before the ground over her grave had settled. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm glad you found your way to this fireside, because what I'm about to tell you isn't a story about anger, though anger runs underneath every sentence of it like a current under ice. It's a story about a woman named Diane Ashworth Colby, who spent the last 8 months of her life doing something her family never saw coming, and about the phone call I got on a Thursday afternoon that changed everything they thought they understood about how this was going to go. Hit subscribe if you haven't, because what Diane built before she left me is one of the most extraordinary things I have ever watched, a human being construct out of nothing but paper, patience, and love. Settle in. Pour something warm if that's your evening ritual. This one takes a while to tell properly, and I intend to tell it properly. My wife's name was Diane Ashworth Colby, born Diane Marie Ashworth in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1960. She was 64 years old when the cancer finally caught up to what it had been chasing for 2 years, and she was, by every measure I have ever applied to another human being, the finest person I ever shared a roof with. She spent 31 years as a court reporter, the woman sitting quiet in the corner of a courtroom, transcribing every word that mattered, while lawyers postured and judges deliberated and lives got decided 12 feet in front of her. You learn something, doing that for 3 decades. You learn that the record is the only thing that survives the room once everyone in it stops talking. Diane used to say that to me all the time, usually apropos of nothing, usually while she was filing something away in the accordion folders she kept in the office closet. The record is the only thing that survives the room. I didn't understand yet how much weight she was putting behind those words. She was also, I want to be honest with you because honesty is the only currency worth spending in a story like this one, a woman with a complicated relationship to the family she came from, not dramatic. Not the kind of thing you'd see acted out in a Sunday movie with raised voices and slammed doors. Complicated in the quiet, load-bearing way certain families are complicated, where everybody smiles at Thanksgiving and nobody says the thing that's actually sitting in the room with them. Diane's mother, Colleen, had died some years before I ever met Diane, but her presence lingered over that family like weather that never fully clears. Diane's sister Patricia had spent her adult life managing the family's affairs with an efficiency that everyone praised and nobody questioned, which is its own kind of dangerous, friend, when you think about it long enough. And Diane's brother Todd lived 2 states away and mostly showed up for holidays and funerals, content to let Patricia run things because it was easier than being the one who ran them. They had not been warm to me from the start. I want to say that plainly. I was 58 when I met Diane at a mutual friend's retirement dinner, a widower myself, 12 years into raising 2 boys, mostly on my own, after their mother passed of an aneurysm that gave us no warning at all. I ran a small HVAC business out of a warehouse on the east side of Mesa, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that keeps a roof over your head but doesn't turn heads at a family gathering. Patricia had opinions about that. She never said them to my face, not directly, but I heard them secondhand often enough to know the shape of them. He's not going to be able to keep up with her. He's got baggage of his own. Why does she need to remarry at 59 anyway? Diane married me regardless, in the fall of 2005, at a small ceremony in her backyard with a string quartet she'd hired herself, and roses she'd grown herself, and Patricia stood up as her sister and gave a toast that was gracious in the specific, careful way. People are gracious when they've decided to tolerate something they can't prevent. I was grateful for the toast. I wasn't naive about what sat underneath it. 19 years, friend. That's what Diane and I built together, in the house on Cortaro Ridge that she'd owned outright since 1994, a full decade before she and I ever exchanged vows in that backyard under a string quartet. 19 years of a life she filled with a kind of steady warmth. I didn't know I'd been missing until I had it. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the late summer of 2023, the kind of diagnosis that arrives already carrying a prognosis nobody wants to say out loud. Diane received the news the way she received everything, with a kind of composed, methodical attention that I came to understand, later, was the same attention she'd once brought to transcribing courtroom testimony word for word, without letting a single syllable slip past her. She asked the oncologist 4 questions. She wrote the answers down in a spiral notebook she kept specifically for this purpose. She thanked him for his time, and then she drove us home, and she sat at our kitchen table, and she told me everything he'd said, in the order he'd said it, and then she told me she needed 2 days before she was ready to talk about what came next. She took her 2 days. And then she made a phone call to a man named Walter Prine. Walter had been Diane's attorney since 2011, back when she'd needed someone to help her untangle a property dispute with a neighbor over a shared fence line, of all things, and had come away from that experience so impressed with his precision that she'd kept him on retainer for anything that mattered ever since. I'd met him twice before the diagnosis, once at a barbecue Diane threw for his 60th birthday, once when Diane brought me into his office in 2013 to update our joint documents after my younger son's college graduation. Walter had the specific quality of a man who has spent decades listening to people explain their families to him and has stopped being surprised by anything a family is capable of. What Diane and Walter built together in the 8 months between her diagnosis and the morning she passed, I did not understand the full architecture of until Walter called me himself, 4 days after the funeral. I knew pieces of it. Diane had told me, in the direct, unhurried way, she told me things that mattered, that she was putting her affairs in order, and that she needed everything airtight, and that I would need to come sign several documents at Walter's office on a particular Thursday in December. I came, I signed. Diane answered every question I had clearly and without hesitation, and I trusted her completely, because 19 years of marriage to that woman had taught me, over and over, without a single exception, that her judgment was worth trusting all the way down. What I did not know was the full scope of what she had built beneath the surface of those signatures. I did not know about the provisions that went beyond the ordinary will and the ordinary trust, the specific architecture she had constructed because she understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what her sister was capable of when there was something worth having on the table. The diagnosis changed the family's orbit in ways I noticed but didn't comment on at the time. Patricia began calling more, not the way a sister frightened for her sibling calls, needing to hear a voice just to confirm it's still there. The way a project manager calls, gathering status updates, keeping the file current. How's the treatment going? What's the prognosis now? What does the oncologist say about timeline? And, eventually, with an increasing frequency that Diane clocked long before I did, questions that circled, gently, persistently, around the house on Cortaro Ridge. Whether we'd thought about downsizing, whether the upkeep was getting to be too much for me to manage alone, whether Diane had given any thought to what would be fair for everyone going forward. Todd flew in from Denver in the spring, the first time he'd been in our home in over 2 years. He arrived with a casserole his wife had made and the specific, over-prepared warmth of a man rehearsing a role on the drive over from the airport. He sat in our living room and talked about his kids and his job for the better part of an hour before he ever pivoted to Diane's health. And when he did pivot, it was with the careful, indirect approach of someone who had been building up to it the whole time. Diane answered him plainly, the way she answered everyone, giving him exactly what the question required and nothing that would invite a follow-up of a particular kind. Patricia called on the first Sunday of every month with what she framed as a casual check-in and what was, in practice, a status meeting with an agenda she never announced out loud. She asked about scans and treatments and how I was holding up and whether the family could do anything to help. There was real warmth in those calls. I want to be fair about that. Patricia did love her sister. What I came to understand, slowly, over those 8 months, was that real love and strategic attention are not opposites, and that a person can hold both at once in a way that makes it very difficult to name either one without acknowledging the other sitting right beside it. In the last phone call before Diane passed, Patricia mentioned, in the careful, sideways way, Patricia mentioned the things she wanted heard, but never wanted attributed to her directly afterward, that the house on Cortaro Ridge carried a lot of memories for the whole family, and that she hoped Diane had given real thought to what would happen to it, and to the life insurance, and to everything, in a way that would feel right to everyone once she was gone. Diane was on speaker. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes. I heard the whole thing. When I looked over at Diane, sitting in the recliner with a throw blanket over her knees, her face wasn't angry. It wasn't even surprised. It was the face of a woman who has been watching something approach on the horizon for a long time, has already stepped out of its path, and can now afford to watch it arrive without flinching. She died in early November. I was there. My older son was there. Diane's oldest friend, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had known her since they were both 19 years old, working the same diner counter in Tulsa, was there because Ruth was the one person from Diane's whole life who had never once asked her for anything except her company on a Sunday afternoon. The end came quiet, the way it comes for people who have made their peace with it in advance. Diane had been making that peace for 8 months, and she had made it thoroughly. It included the documents, it included conversations I wasn't part of. And it included, I would learn from Ruth's letter 3 weeks later, things she had said out loud in her final days that she needed someone to remember and pass along once she no longer could say them herself. The funeral was 6 days after she passed. I want to walk you through that morning, friend, not for your sympathy, because I'm not telling you this story to be pitied. I'm telling it because sitting through that morning is the only way you'll understand why I said absolutely nothing when the claims call came 3 weeks later. I arrived at the funeral home 45 minutes early. I spoke with the director about the order of service. I stood in the receiving line and greeted every person who came through the door with the composure Diane would have expected of me, the same composure I expected of myself, because grief in public is something you manage for the sake of the room, and grief in private is a different animal entirely, one I would meet later, alone, in a house that had gone very quiet. I sat in the front pew. Someone handed me the program. I opened it to the photograph first, Diane at 55, laughing at something off camera, and whoever had chosen that photo had chosen well, because it was one of the rare pictures where everything true about her had risen fully to the surface of her face at once. I held that photograph in my hands for the length of time a man holds a photograph of his wife at her funeral, which is a length of time that doesn't have a proper name. Then I read the rest of the page. Diane Ashworth Colby is survived by her devoted sister, Patricia Voss, her brother, Todd Ashworth, and her nephews and nieces. Nothing else. No mention of a husband. Not one word. About 19 years. I looked for my own name, the way you look for a face in a crowd you're certain has to be there, and it wasn't. It hadn't been left out of an acknowledgement section, friend. It had been left out entirely, as if I had simply never existed in the life being described on that page. I read it twice, to make sure I hadn't missed a line. I hadn't. I folded the program once, slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket, and sat through the service with the stillness of a man who has already decided, calmly, without a trace of drama, that the moment for a response is not this moment. That moment came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, in a claims office with fluorescent lighting and the low hum of a hold music system somewhere behind the front desk. I had gone in to file the death benefit claim on Diane's life insurance policy myself, the one she and I had reviewed together not 18 months before her diagnosis, the one that named me, in her own handwriting, on the beneficiary line. The representative, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, delivering this particular piece of news, pulled up the file, went quiet for a beat too long, and told me the claim had already been processed, paid in full, 3 weeks prior, to a beneficiary listed as Patricia Voss. I asked him to repeat that. He did. I asked him how a beneficiary designation gets changed on a policy belonging to a woman actively dying of pancreatic cancer. He said the paperwork on file showed a change of beneficiary form, signed and dated, submitted the previous March. Diane, by March, could no longer hold a pen for more than a signature's worth of strokes, without her hand shaking so badly the letters came out unrecognizable. I had watched her struggle to sign a birthday card for my son that same month. I did not say any of that to the young man behind the desk. I thanked him for his time. I asked for a copy of the change of beneficiary form to be mailed to my address. And I drove home in the kind of silence that isn't empty at all, friend. It's the loudest silence there is. Diane had told me, in the plain, unhurried way, she told me things that mattered before the urgency of them was necessary, that her sister would likely make some kind of move within the first month after the funeral, and that when it happened, I should call Walter and no one else. She'd told me that with the calm of a woman describing tomorrow's weather forecast for a storm she'd already built the shelter against. I had nodded. I had understood the words. I had not understood the full depth of the shelter until I sat across from Walter Prine 4 days after the funeral, and he laid the documents out on the table between us in the order he'd clearly decided mattered most. He called that Monday morning, 4 days after we buried Diane, and asked if I could come in. His voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who has spent 30 years learning how to deliver serious information without letting the weight of it change the pace of his sentences. He said there were documents I needed to see, and that the timing was important because certain provisions in Diane's estate had activated the moment she passed, and he wanted me sitting in his office with the full picture before I heard from anyone else. Before I heard from anyone else. I've turned that phrase over in my mind more times than I can count since that morning, friend, because it told me everything at once. Diane had briefed her attorney on exactly what was coming. She had told Walter who would call, and roughly when, and what they would likely say, and she had made absolutely certain that I would be sitting across a desk with the complete truth in my hands before the first phone call from her family ever reached me. I arrived at Walter's office at 9 that morning. The conference room had the particular hush of a space that has hosted a great many difficult conversations over a great many years, furnished with soft light and chairs built for sitting in longer than is comfortable. Walter had the documents arranged in the order he wanted to walk me through them, which was, I came to understand, itself a kind of narrative, each one building toward the next. First came the trust, established the previous January, 10 months before Diane passed, 10 months during which she still had the full clarity of a woman who had not yet been touched by the illness, eating away at the edges of her thinking. The Diane Ashworth Colby Living Trust held the house on Cortaro Ridge, confirmed as mine, its ownership history documented back to 1994, over a decade before Diane and I ever stood in that backyard and made our promises to each other. It held our joint accounts, distributed according to a schedule Diane had drafted herself, one Walter had formalized without a single alteration, because there was nothing in her draft that needed correcting. Second came the life insurance policy itself, and this was the piece that made my hands go still on the edge of the table. Walter told me that Diane, back in the previous February, 9 months before she died, had come into his office alone, without telling me, and had done 2 things. She had taken out a second life insurance policy entirely separate from the one Patricia would later manipulate, a policy Patricia did not know existed, naming me as sole beneficiary, funded and locked in before the diagnosis had even been confirmed. And she had also, on that same visit, instructed Walter to document, in a signed and dated letter kept in her file, her explicit understanding that her sister had, on at least one prior occasion years earlier, attempted something similar with their late mother's estate, and that she, Diane, no longer trusted Patricia with unsupervised access to any financial document bearing her signature. She had seen this exact maneuver before it ever happened to her. She had spent 9 months building a second door out of a room she suspected her sister intended to lock her out of. Third, and Walter set this one down last, deliberately, the way you save the strongest card for the final play, was a certified letter, drafted and notarized the previous March, the very month the fraudulent beneficiary change would later claim to have been signed. In it, Diane stated, in her own words, reviewed and witnessed by Walter himself and a second notary in his office, that she was, as of that date, still in full possession of her mental faculties, that she had reviewed all beneficiary designations on all policies in her name that month with her own hand and her own eyes, that no changes had been authorized or requested by her, and that any future document purporting to show a change of beneficiary dated on or near this letter should be treated, on its face, as fraudulent. She had anticipated the forgery before it was ever committed. She had built the proof of the crime before the crime occurred. I sat with that letter in my hands for a long while. Walter, let me. He told me he'd already spoken, the week prior, with a fraud investigator at the insurance carrier, using Diane's March letter as the basis for the claim, and that the carrier had opened a formal investigation into the change of beneficiary form, comparing the signature against verified samples of Diane's handwriting from the same period, samples that showed, without much room for argument, the visible tremor of a woman 5 months into aggressive chemotherapy. Walter said he expected the carrier to claw back the paid benefit from Patricia and reissue it, in full, to me, under the terms of the March letter, and that in the meantime, the second policy Diane had quietly funded 9 months earlier, the one Patricia never knew existed, remained untouched, unclaimed, and entirely mine to file against whenever I was ready. She had built 2 doors, friend. She had let her sister walk through the one that was rigged to collapse. I want to tell you about the phone call, because it came exactly when Diane said it would, and it went nothing like Patricia expected. It was a Sunday evening, first Sunday of the month, right on the schedule Patricia had kept for 8 straight months of check-in calls. Her voice carried that same particular tone she used when she was conducting business, dressed up as a conversation. The condolences came first, and I believe they were sincere, in the way that sincerity and self-interest sat side by side in Patricia without either one canceling the other out. Then, with the smooth pivot of someone who had been rehearsing this transition since before the funeral, she moved to the subject of settling things. She used the word family more than once. She mentioned that their mother's memory mattered, that the house held sentiment for everyone, that she hoped we could keep this among family rather than let it get complicated with lawyers. That sentence did the most work of anything she said all evening. I let her finish. Then I told her that all matters relating to Diane's estate were being handled by Walter Prine, and I gave her his number, and I told her he could answer any questions she had. I did not mention the claims office. I did not mention the fraud investigation already underway. I did not mention the program from the funeral, still folded in my jacket pocket, though I was aware of its weight the entire time she was speaking. Just the number. Patricia's tone changed in the way a tone changes when a conversation someone has been rehearsing for weeks runs headlong into a structure they didn't know was waiting for them. She said she thought this was something the family could work out on their own. I told her Walter was the appropriate point of contact, and I wished her a good evening, and I hung up. She called Walter the following morning. Walter called me that same afternoon, and I could hear, even through the phone, the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a long time for a conversation he already knew the outcome of. He told me Patricia had asked, carefully, about the life insurance. Walter had informed her, in the calm and factual manner of a man reading from a file, that the carrier's fraud unit was actively investigating a change of beneficiary form bearing a signature that did not match any verified sample from the same time period, and that the woman listed as the current beneficiary of record might want to consult her own attorney regarding the funds she had already received, because the carrier's standard procedure in confirmed fraud cases was to pursue full recovery, with interest, and in some jurisdictions, referral to the district attorney's office for further review. There had been a long pause on the line after that, Walter said, the specific kind of pause that belongs to a person recalculating everything they had planned to say next. Then Patricia said she would need to look into a few things, and the call ended, and there were no further inquiries, not from Patricia, not from Todd, not one more word. The carrier completed its investigation 11 weeks later. The forged form was confirmed as fraudulent. The funds were clawed back from Patricia's account under threat of a civil suit Walter had already begun drafting, and the original policy was reissued to me in full, exactly as Diane's March letter had anticipated it would need to be. I never had to raise my voice. I never had to write a single accusing word. I only ever had to hand people a phone number. There's one more thing I want to tell you before I let you go tonight, and it's the piece I've turned over in my mind more than any other since all of this happened. About 10 weeks after the funeral, I got a letter in the mail, handwritten in the careful, looping penmanship of someone who understood that the way you write a thing is part of what you're saying with it. It was from Ruth, Diane's oldest friend, the one who'd sat beside her in her final days. Ruth told me something Diane had said to her, in the quiet hours of one of those last afternoons, sitting together in the sunroom Diane had built onto the back of the house herself in 2010, looking out over the citrus trees she'd planted, the year we married. Diane had looked around that room, Ruth wrote, at the furniture, at the shelves she'd arranged just so over years of living in that house, at the photographs on the wall, the one of the two of us at our wedding, the one from a trip we'd taken to the Grand Canyon in 2016, the one of my younger son at his college graduation that Diane had framed and hung herself because she said every person who mattered to this family deserved a place on that wall. She had looked at all of it, Ruth said, the way a person looks at things they love when they're getting ready to leave them behind, and she had told Ruth she wasn't afraid of what came for her. What frightened her, she said, was what might come for me once she couldn't stand between us anymore. She had watched her own mother's estate get quietly picked apart by exactly this kind of maneuver years earlier and had never forgotten the shape of it. She was not going to let it happen twice, and she certainly was not going to let it happen to me. And then Ruth wrote down the sentence Diane had said last, the one I have read more times than I can count since that letter arrived. She said, "He thinks I spent all that time protecting money. I was protecting him. The money would have sorted itself out eventually. What I needed him to know was that even while I was dying, I was still thinking about keeping him safe." I folded Ruth's letter and put it in the drawer of my desk, where I keep the things that matter most. The funeral program is in that drawer too, the one with my name missing from it entirely. I don't keep it out of bitterness, friend. I keep it because Diane taught me something in those final months that I don't think I'd have learned any other way, which is that preparing your documents isn't a sign that you don't trust the people you love. It's a sign that you understand, clearly and without illusion, exactly what some people are capable of when grief creates an opening they think nobody's watching. And that program, with its careful, deliberate omission, is the clearest proof I have of why the second policy, the fraud letter, the whole quiet architecture Diane built in secret, was ever necessary in the first place. She was right about all of it. She was right about her sister. She was right about the documents. She was right that I would need the shelter she was building long before I understood she was building it at all. She was always right. That was simply the kind of woman she was. I go out to the sunroom most mornings now, friend, with my coffee, and I sit in the chair she used to sit in, looking out at the citrus trees, and that's where I find her most clearly, in the particular way she arranged this life so that something steady would still be standing here after she wasn't. She was thinking ahead when she planted those trees. She was thinking ahead when she walked into Walter's office alone that February, 9 months before the end, and quietly built a second door. She spent the last months of her life thinking about my future more than she ever spent thinking about her own, and that is not the kind of love that needs a line in a funeral program to prove it happened. It proves itself in other ways. Before I let you go tonight, I want to say one thing directly to whoever out there is watching this and finds themselves loving someone whose family has already decided, quietly, that you don't belong in the picture. I want you to hear something Diane understood and taught me by example in the most permanent way a person can teach anything to another person. The documentation matters. The attorney matters. The notarized letter written in your own hand, filed away months before anyone thinks to ask for it, matters more than you can possibly know until the day it's the only thing standing between you and someone who decided your grief was an opportunity. Love doesn't need proof, friend, but the people who don't share your love, the ones who'll rewrite the story the very first chance they get, they only understand one language, and it's the language written on paper, signed, dated, and witnessed, well in advance of the day you need it to speak for you. Diane understood what was coming. She spent the last 8 months of her life making certain I'd be standing here, telling you this, instead of standing in a lawyer's office with nothing in my hands. She put her name on every document that mattered. She built a door her sister never even knew existed, and then she folded her hands, and she let the paper say the things she could no longer say herself. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me down in the comments about someone in your own life who protected the people they loved, even while they themselves were the one who needed protecting the most. Those stories deserve to be told out loud, every one of them. I'll see you next time, friend.